This is an audio short story, No Matter What, by Jim Pope, read by Quack McMullard, Chapter 10.
No Matter What, Chapter 10. Paul and Janet woke to a new day, when they would be going their separate ways. Paul unloaded the life raft, threw it overboard while holding the inflatable cord. When the cord pulled tight, the raft instantly inflated. It was not very big, so it would be a bit tight for Paul and Janet, and it would have to be rowed. But according to the GPS, they did not have far to go. Paul was keen to get going, even though it felt like they were in the middle of nowhere. He was aware that with the growth of the grey nomad movement, someone could appear at any moment. They climbed aboard the raft and started rowing. They made slow progress, taking in turns to row until the GPS indicated they were at their location. They climbed out of the raft and made their way up the embankment, but nothing looked familiar to Paul. Had they passed the cars, or were they further upstream? The landscape looked much the same in all directions, but there were some trees a few hundred metres upstream, so they walked towards them. As they got closer, things started to look familiar, and then Paul spotted the camouflage netting over the foresters. After removing the netting, Paul checked around the cars and all seemed well. The tyres had air in them, so he opened the door of one of them, inserted the key and tried to start it. It fired up without problem. He tried the next one, but no such luck. The battery was flat. So after a bit of manoeuvring, he jumper-lead started the second Forester. Last time Paul was here, he found his way back to the road by following the tracks left by the Forester as he drove it to the riverbank, but those tracks were long gone. But he did have a compass bearing, so with Paul driving one and Janet driving the other, they headed into the desert. After a few kilometres they came to a rough area which Paul recognised from when he delivered the cars, so they knew they were heading in the right direction. After a few more kilometres, and as if by magic, they found the road. Well, to call it a road is overstating things a bit. It was more like a track. Ahead of them lay 150 kilometres of dirt road, and most of it in poor condition. Paul and Janet took some time out to eat, drink, and talk about what lay ahead. It was slow going for the first 20 or so kilometres, as the road was rough and not at all well defined, but after a while it started to open up a bit. They started to make good time, travelling at about 50 kilometres an hour, but they had to be very watchful, as every now and then, and without warning, the road would turn rough with large potholes that could swallow a Forester. It took a little over 3 hours to get to the Great Northern Highway, which was the main road between Darwin and Perth. As they approached the highway, they pulled over, as this was the point where they would be going their separate ways. Janet would turn left and head towards Darwin, and Paul would turn right towards Perth. They got out of the cars and had a bit to eat and drink, as it was a good 40 degrees and they needed to keep hydrated. As they stood in front of one of the Foresters, using the bonnet as a table, Paul said, "Well, just turn left here and follow your nose. You've got money and food and water, so you'll be right. If you get tired, stop and sleep in the car. If all goes well, you should be in Darwin by 8 or 9 tonight." Janet just looked at him and said, "I still can't see why you can't come with me. You said that they didn't have any evidence against you." "Not when I left they didn't, but you never know. Lizzie's pretty smart, so it's better to be safe than sorry," Paul said, and then added, "As soon as I get to somewhere with the internet, I'll look up what the media are saying, and if there's nothing about me being wanted man, then I'll turn around and meet you in Darwin. If all is well, I'll wait for you in Darwin. But what if you're a wanted man?" replied Janet. "Well then, this is goodbye," said Paul. "I'll miss you." Janet said nothing, just looked at Paul and wiped a tear from her eye. as she hugged him. Paul walked to his car, trying to hide the tears, turned and waved, and then called out, "Don't forget to get Colin out of the cat home." "As if I would," she replied. Paul followed Janet for the last few hundred metres of the dirt road before they turned in different directions. Janet had no ID or driver's licence, and the car was registered in Paul's name. So if she was pulled over by the police, things would be difficult. She might get a small fine for not having a licence with her, but she had not done anything against Western Australian laws. Australia had no extradition treaty with the country which she had just escaped from, so there would be no problems in that regard. With a bit of luck, she'd have a trouble-free trip home, with no police interaction. She felt free driving through the outback, and even though she wanted to get home, she also liked the idea of a few weeks driving across the country. Paul headed south, travelling under the name Matthew Johnson. He had a driver's licence, and the car was registered under that name. The IDs were pretty solid, so he had no fear of running into problems with the police. It was late in the afternoon before he pulled into Broome. He found a motel and was looking forward to a good night's sleep. The motel had internet access, so he checked out the media coverage of the Great Escape. As it happened in a country with a restricted media, there was not a lot of information about the escape itself, but he did find a number of reports. Even though Paul knew deep down he would have to start a new life as Matthew Johnson, he still hoped he could go back to his old life. Reading the media reports, it became real to Paul that from now on he would be Matthew Johnson. He found one report about burglaries which had a picture of Lizzie standing outside the garage with the caption reading, "Head of Investigation, Detective Sergeant Elizabeth Bennett." It took Janet just short of 2 weeks to get home. The next day she went to the cat home to collect Colin. When she got home, the police were standing at her front door, waiting for her. As she walked towards her front door carrying Colin in a cat cage, Lizzie said, "Hello, my name is Detective Sergeant Elizabeth Bennett, and this is Detective Constable George Blake." "You must be Lizzie. I've heard a lot about you. Nice to meet you," Janet said as she put Colin's cage down and put her hand out to shake hands with Lizzie. Janet opened the front door, picked up Colin's cage and said, "Come on in, you two. Would you like a cup of tea or maybe some orange juice?" "No thanks, can I ask you?" But before Lizzie finished, Janet said, "George, can you shut the door behind you? I just want to let Colin out." And then, "Sorry Lizzie, go on." "Can I ask you, do you know the whereabouts of your brother Paul?" inquired Lizzie. "What, no small talk, Lizzie? Straight down to business," said Janet, while letting Colin out. Colin ran out of his cage and straight into the bedroom. "Now that's a great welcome home after all this time, Colin." Then turning to Lizzie and George, she said, "Cats, don't you just love them?" Janet continued, "Paul tells me you were going to look after Colin if things hadn't worked out. Thanks for that." "Don't you know where Paul is?" Lizzie asked again. "No idea, Lizzie. I wish I did. I wish none of the last 12 months had happened, or better still, I wish I'd never won that holiday," said Janet. "Where did you last see him?" asked Lizzie. "On the Great North Highway, heading south," replied Janet. "What was he driving?" asked Lizzie. "A Subaru Forester," replied Janet. She then added, "But Lizzie, that was 2 weeks ago, and so he's long gone, as is the car." "I know," said Lizzie. "Are the newspaper accounts of your escape accurate?" asked George. "That's not part of our inquiry, Constable," said Lizzie. "I know, it just sounds incredible," said George. "It's all right, Lizzie. It was unbelievable. It's a miracle I'm standing here today. The media only know half of it," Janet explained. "I just wish," she paused, "things could have turned out different." "Thanks for your cooperation. We may have more questions at a later date," said Lizzie. Lizzie and George started walking towards the door. "No problem, Lizzie," replied Janet. Lizzie stopped at the front door, turned to Janet and asked, "How is he?" "Last time I saw him, he was fine," replied Janet. Paul had been on the road for 3 weeks when he finally arrived at his destination. 100 acres of what could only be described as very poor quality land. About an hour's drive west of Kempsey, just outside a small village called Bellbrook. Paul had purchased it years ago for next to nothing, with the intent of using it as a bit of a getaway. He had got as far as building a small cabin, but time had overtaken him and he had not been there for some time. He had sold it to himself, well, Matthew Johnson, some months earlier, so it was safe in terms of someone tracking him down. It was all a bit overgrown and dishevelled, but it was home now and he could see potential. Over the next 6 months, Paul worked away, turning a small cabin into a home, building a shed and setting up the gardens. He even got a part-time job mowing grass at a nearby camping and bush walking retreat. Paul needed to get his Ford Escort out of storage in Sydney, so he travelled by train to Sydney. It was still registered, but had been sitting for some time, so he expected to have some problems. But as it turned out, all it needed was a new battery. While in Sydney, he could not resist visiting Janet, so he got a taxi to the end of her street and then used the rear entrance so no one would see him. She was not home, so he let himself in and waited. Colin recognised him right away and came over and sat on his lap. He didn't have long to wait for Janet. He heard her open the front door, so he stood up and pushed Colin into the lounge. Janet couldn't believe her eyes and ran over and hugged him. "How are you?" Janet asked. "Fine," replied Paul. "What are you doing here?" asked Janet. "Picking up the car," replied Paul. "Not that old Ford Escort," said Janet. Paul just smiled, which meant, of course. "How long before you go?" said Janet. "Only a few hours," replied Paul. "Long enough for dinner," said Janet. "You cooking?" Paul asked. "Yes, of course," said Janet. Janet went to the kitchen and started getting things ready. "Have you seen anything of Lizzie?" Paul asked. "Not lately," said Janet. Paul sat on the lounge and Colin came and sat on his lap, while Janet continued getting dinner ready. After dinner, Paul asked, "How have things been for you?" "There was a bit of media and police attention for the first few months, but that has died away now," Janet said, and then continued, "Life is just about back to normal. I've got my old job back, and other than the occasional bad dream, I'm good." "What about you?" Janet asked. "Not too bad. Living the quiet life out in the bush," said Paul. Then he smiled at her, a smile that told her exactly how he was. Time passed very quickly, and before they knew it, it was time for Paul to leave. Janet gave him a lift to where the Escort was stored, and they parted again. Paul pulled into a garage and bought some petrol and a bunch of flowers. He only wanted a red rose, so he pulled one out of the bunch and gave the rest of the bunch to the woman behind the counter. He drove to the end of Lizzie Street, walked to her house. It was just after midnight. Keeping to the shadows, he made his way to the front door, quickly picking the lock and quietly making his way inside. He made his way to her bedroom. He could see her lying on the bed in the moonlight, which reminded him of the last time he saw her. He placed a rose and a note on her bedside table. The note simply read, "Miss you." Paul left, locking the front door after himself, and walked back to the car and headed home.
Copyright 2022. To listen to or read more chapters, go to www.yellowduckmotorsport.com. Click on Books, drop-down menu, then click on No Matter What. To listen to more chapters or to read, click on Chapters.